Well, I am excited to have Chuck Todd join us today. Chuck, I always joke that this weird speaker program we have is what would happen if Meet the Press and Wayne's World were ever mixed together. I'd love to
Now
tell
they call it
you,
YouTube, Bruce, but that's
right.
okay.
I'd love to tell you that we have Mike Myers as a surprise guest, which would then put that to the test. We don't.
Yeah.
You have been nice enough to have me on the Chuck Toddcast several times. Chuck, welcome to Melavision. It's awesome to have you here.
Mehlman vision. I love it. I love it.
I think we'll
I love to be here.
Bellavision, but we'll keep.
Wait, say it again. It's Melavision,
I'm
not
going
Mehlman
Bellavision with
vision.
an H in there, but
Okay. All
so
right. All right. Yes, sir. I'll get it right.
most important, and I went back and I think it's Chuck Todd 5.0. I want to understand what's new for Chuck Todd. Your earliest career, you were on campaigns. Chuck 2.0 was the hotline and a print journalist.
Yeah.
I'm separating now the NBCs. 3.0 was the political director under Russert, and 4.0 was as the successor at Meet the Press. Tell everybody about Chuck Todd 5.0. What's next for you? You're a young man
Well,
with a bright future.
yeah, I appreciate you saying that. It's funny. Only in Washington is 53 young, right? And it's kind of nice, right? It's the upside of us continuing to leave the octogenarians in charge of things. Um, Look, the one thing I've worked on other entrepreneurial ventures that belong to other people. I've never done it myself, and so this is, in that sense, this is the first time I've wanted to. It's like, okay, put my money where my mouth is about, how to build a better mousetrap when it comes to a news organization, and really that's what this is. It's the public part is what I'm going to be. I enjoy the podcast a lot. I still think I have a lot to add when it comes to politics. I love it. I love it I've sort of been referring to myself as a political anthropologist. And that's really how I enjoy consuming politics. It's a lot easier to consume it that way than if you consume it on the day to day that so much of Washington consumes. But I really am animated about trying to contribute to the solution of improving the information ecosystem. And I say that because I think I was a contributor to the breakdown of it, unbeknownst. You think about the newsletter. Right now we're all inundated with newsletters in Washington. Well, we were the original newsletter hotline, right? And it became, every newsletter that's out there today has its roots in the hotline. And what made us different is that we couldn't have succeeded if there wasn't local coverage of politics. And over a period of time, we saw this transformation, particularly of political news, that instead of Washington being informed about American politics through the lens of local reporters, it is now most of the political journalists live on the East Coast, live in Washington, and parachute in to cover politics or maybe cover it on a data-driven way. But we really have sort of flipped the script. It's very top down. And I think that's contributed to this sense of Washington doesn't understand. People don't understand what goes on in Washington. Well, I understand why, because nobody in their own community reports on Washington's comings and goings and doings through the prism of that local community anymore. And I just think that we can do better. I think that I understand how this happened. It didn't happen because somebody intentionally said, let's kill local news. The market happened. The digital revolution happened. People made the mistake. I always use Knight Ridder as an example I use because in the 90s, when I was at the hotline, having a relationship with Knight Ridder was really important because we wanted every unique version of a story that a Washington Bureau producer would produce for a specific Knight Ridder paper. So they'd have a member of their Washington Bureau just dedicated to the Kansas City Star, or just dedicated to the Philadelphia Inquirer, or just dedicated to the Miami Herald, or St. Paul Pioneer Press, and all of the Knight Ridder papers. And then one day, clearly an accountant or bean counter at Knight Ridder said, why do we need 30 versions of the same story with just a small little difference in the local lead? And from an accounting perspective or a widget perspective, that made a lot of sense. It turns out we did need we probably need 435 different versions of stories because every congressional district is impacted slightly differently when legislation is passed, and explaining how that works. And instead, when you only have one or two reporting from a nationalized perspective, you aren't going to think, well, I don't know if that's for me, right? I don't know what it means for me. I think it's a perfectly reasonable reaction by the general public right now because they really don't have any other alternative system out there. So it's clear to me we need to revitalize local news. I get that a man named Craig one day said, why shouldn't classifieds be free? I've met Mr. Newmark, Craig Newmark, who's the godfather of Craigslist. Um, and, he said, he goes, had I known it was going to gut local newspapers basically from coast to coast, he might not have pursued it, but he said somebody else would have, even if I didn't, which is
Yeah.
100% true.
No, somebody else definitely would have.
Of course. And so what I think needs to happen is we need to come up. I've been spending the last year getting to know these local news startups. Many of them are nonprofit. And, I always say I was raised Republican. I'm raised a free market capitalist. And I just think nonprofit is code sometimes for leans left. And if you don't have a sustainable revenue stream, you're not going to be able to sustain journalism. So I want to find a for-profit solution. And B, I think I have a thesis that if we start by overcovering and saturation coverage of local youth sports and high school sports, that's how you can begin to build trust in a community. And perhaps that is the way to finance the journalism, where advertisers feel comfortable, advertising for all the, local coverage and become the home of streaming youth sports. And I have a whole sort of idea of how I think this could be done, but essentially going back and creating supercharging the acceleration of new community news. And I don't want to own these things. I want to help essentially franchise owners, if you will. I want to help find local publishers to help start these local ventures, because I think if we can complain about the tech companies all we want and algorithms, but we're not doing anything about those anytime soon. Because I don't think, well, even if Washington collectively believes they need to be regulated, each side doesn't trust the other side to be the regulator. So we're not going to be doing that anytime soon. So the only other way to clean up this ecosystem is to essentially saturate it with better locally sourced information. And that, I want to give that a shot. I think I have a little bit of sort of before my sell-by date. And I want to use my ability to get meetings and convene people and see if I could put together a group to make this happen. So that's, one part. I'll be doing what I enjoy doing, examining the American political scene. But the other part is trying to build this larger media company, and frankly, to try to look. I think there's a lot of money to be made in youth sports for all the college, what's going on in the world of college. I hope it's also a way to fund new local journalism.
Well, that's a lot there. Super interesting. It's one of the things we had Steve Krakauer maybe 2 years ago after
Yeah.
writing his great book. One of his points is it's not simply national news, but all of the people who are doing all of the political coverage live in basically one of three cities.
Yep.
All went to one of like 20 colleges, and that part of what might make your vision, if it's going to ultimately be trusted, successful, would be not Washington, not elite educated people. It's New York Times says what you're launching along with a bank may have funding of up to $2 billion. So my first question was whether you're looking to acquire bipartisan lobbying firms.
Well, I need to have, it's funny. I said I'm hoping to raise that. I didn't say I had it.
Got it. But
There's a big difference.
We need Saliza, who I've had on here. I know you're with every week. Maybe this is like instructions for you and him next time. With your theory here, is there a risk you're going to turn now to NIL at high school and NIL at middle school? I mean, it's
not.
Great, but
you say that. Look, here's the thesis I have on this. It's not that you look, I grew up in Florida, which is, pardon my friends in Texas, we also are impressed with our high school sporting community. And, the three South Florida counties produce more college football Division I athletes than the entire state of Ohio. So, let alone the entire state of Florida when you add that into it. But I'm just talking about Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade. me growing up in Miami. So it is this NIL business has already hit the high schools. We have something in Florida called the IMG Academy. They
Yeah.
start recruiting potential new athletes. I've got a friend of mine who's got a really good 10-year-old hockey player.
Oh my God.
They're being recruited by IMG Academy, which is essentially a boarding school for the athletically gifted. But here's my theory. My thesis on this is as follows. Because of when you and I were going to college, arguably, if you were an athlete, even if you were good enough to get a scholarship in college as a college athlete, you had about a 1% chance to become a professional athlete. You want to talk about a fragmentation, the sports industry has really fragmented. And, in your 20s now, I think you now have about a 1 in 5 chance of making money doing athletics. Not saying you're going to do it and become Shohei Ohtani or Juan Soto, but you got 90,000 people showing up for volleyball games in Nebraska. You've got now two competitors in professional soccer. You got MLS as a direct competitor. There's 2 professional women's soccer leagues. You've got Major League Lacrosse, which has been incrementally growing. The point is, it's not just basketball, football, and baseball anymore. And so what is the trickle-down effect? You're going to have more parents put their kids in the youth sports. My father was a musician, and he encouraged me to take up the French horn simply because he said, you know what, it might be your ticket to college. Well, it was. It's how I paid for school. I'd have gone to a community college if I didn't play the French horn. But I think there's more parents now, you're going to get the piano lessons, see if they have musical talent, or you try all these youth sports. And I think you're going to see an exponential increase in the participation of youth sports because of all of this money in college and all of the opportunity that it seems to present to families. And then it's also, you already are seeing it in high school. And so, look, I think that it's become a bigger part of our culture. And I actually believe it's the best way to bring red and blue together. Red America and blue America wants to watch their kid play sports.
Yeah, but Chuck,
I just view it as, I think that, and if you're, if aunts and uncles will pay for a live stream to see their kid play. So I just think that if you look, I'm not sitting here saying this is all going to work. I just think the amount of money, I'm telling you, with all this NIL, what we're seeing in the professionalization of college sports, it is going to trickle down and only increase the interest across the board beyond just basketball and football.
So I share your observation that,
Mm-hmm.
that we've seen a massive monetization and professionalization of college sports.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to see that as a negative. And I don't know what the fire break is to stop it from getting to high schools and middle schools, and maybe I'm just an old school fuddy-duddy here, but I think your instincts on where local media could succeed are right. But I wonder if one of the obvious immediate effects would be further monetizing and professionalizing and kind of losing the Norman Rockwell ideal
Wow.
of sports and just, at this point, hey, it's middle school baseball sponsored by Wheaties.
You say that. I played Pop Warner football, and we couldn't have had jerseys if the local law firm didn't pay for the jerseys. I mean, this isn't new, right? We've always needed little league sponsors, right? You go to your, our favorite pizza place always was very proud of the little league team, and if they won, they'd put up the picture, right? So, I look. I'm a college football fanatic. I miss the old conferences. I hope, frankly, private equity actually figures out how to break the conferences. I look at the 1984 Supreme Court ruling, and the dissent that was written by the only college athlete that was on the Supreme Court at the time, Byron Whizzer White, who, to his credit, saw all this happening. He foresaw everything that was going to happen once he was basically trying. But, you're essentially, it all depends on how much of a free marketeer you are. Arguably, the college sports that you and I may miss was stifling competition in some ways, right? It was an intentional stifling. I, you know, I do think the NCAA sort of lost its way the minute they signed $1 billion TV contract for the NCAA basketball tournament, because that literally that headline happens, and I think within three months, Charles O'Bannon, one of the O'Bannon brothers, files that suit, which has changed everything forever. Look, I there's so many ways college sports has messed this up. It's like trying to figure out why is our American democracy so screwed up, and we could sit here and say,
We're
well, there
getting
was
to
this
that next.
right, there was this fork of the road, this fork of the road. Like, I remember 20 years ago talking to an athletic director going, guys, why don't you just come up with an annuity plan so that there is money that every college athlete gets when they leave the program. And if you leave after 1 year, you get a certain amount of money. 2 years, this much. 3 years, this much. 4 years, this much. Because you are making a ton of money off of these kids. So they ought to get something for the effort. If they're grown adults at 18, that's adult in this country. It's certainly old enough to be handed a gun and fight for this country. I hear you. It's funny. Like sometimes I'm the one trying to defend the old ways. Can't we go back? Sometimes the toothpaste is so out of the tubes you can't. It's like how I feel about what Trump's trying to do with tariffs. I understand what he wishes could be done, but you have to turn back the clock on humanity 100 years in order to accomplish what he's trying to do, and it's just not possible.
I actually want to get the tariffs in a minute or two, but something that I struggle with, Chuck, and
Hmm.
my middle son's girlfriend, who's a journalist, and I have gone around back and forth on this over some dinners.
Hmm.
Is it the best of times or the worst of times for media? You've pointed out
Mm,
there's a monetization problem. You're seeing Axios, CNN,
right.
others laying people off. At the same time, as a consumer of content, it's never been a better time. I think in
Right.
human history, it's easier for writers and thinkers. Our buddy
Yeah.
Saliza is doing a great job, coming
Hmm.
out on his own. Mark Halperin's Worldwide of News is like
Right.
combining stuff. You've got podcasts, Substacks, Jonah Goldberg's Dispatch, Barry
Right.
Weiss's Free Press. I have 100% certainty. I mean, I've always
Right.
been reading your stuff from NBC, but in some ways, separating you from NBC gives you more flexibility, more freedom,
Correct.
probably greater trust. So, yeah,
Yes.
it's a tough time for a business,
Yeah.
media business, but it seems like it's never been a better time for great content. Moira, my middle son's girlfriend, points out,
Hmm.
yeah, but you are a sophisticated consumer of content, Bruce, so you know the difference between
Yeah.
disinformation and accurate information. But a whole lot of readers have never been more confused or misled,
Hmm.
and that's a fair point. What is your take? Best of times, worst of times?
I say yes because your analysis is correct, and in fact, frankly, as I've been going about this, um, and when I was deciding, did I want to, as look, I knew I wanted to pursue a local this big idea. I had been a part of startup for 15 years, and but was a worker bee, not the one guiding things. And I did want to. I knew I wanted to do this. The question was, did I want to hang my hat at an established media organization or not? And you realize there are, to a certain extent, you're better off not doing that. You're better off, frankly, having 3 or 4 associations, but controlling your own name, image, and likeness. Ooh, what did I just do there, right? Um, but so for me personally, it was better to go independent. Um, but let me tell you the downsides of being independent. The downsides of being independent is, you know, I used to really defend corporate ownership of media. If when Richard Engel was kidnapped, Comcast had the resources, had the contacts, had the ability to make sure the American government was going to leave him behind. Um, the protection of a big media corporation like that is something that in theory allows you to do some deep dive investigative journalism. So, for instance, take either Saliz or myself or Mark Halperin. None of us are going to have the time to sort of take 3 months off to do a deep dive investigative piece. You pick the topic, right? We're just, so as an independent, you don't have, there's certain resources you lack that you just aren't able to do. Now, unfortunately these days, because I think of the you I have really come to sour on the idea of publicly traded companies owning news organizations if the news organization can't essentially operate independently, right? And I think that we have seen we're in a situation now, and there's a variety of reasons why we're in this situation where that these publicly traded companies have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders over the general public. And by the way, they do, right? Comcast has to be more responsive to its shareholders than the NBC News audience. And that's an uncomfortable conclusion to come to. By the way, this is true of Disney, Warner Brothers. Okay, I don't want to, I'm just being honest. And so it's suddenly you're sort of, you feel a little bit, even if nobody is telling you you can't do certain things, you can feel the restraint. And you certainly feel it in this moment. I've been very disappointed. I'm like wondering, where's the K Graham of this generation? I think there's been a huge mistake not defending AP more publicly, and not trying to draw a line. And by not drawing a line at that moment, now they're pushing back even more and pushing back even more. I mean, it's a classic case where if you don't stand for something, if you don't stand for your principles of defending the First Amendment, you know, I have mixed minds about what they did with AP. I do believe, hey, the president can decide which reporters he deals with. That's his prerogative. But the reasoning they made to kick AP out was unconstitutional. They have we have freedom of speech. If they choose that they're going to call it Gulf of Mexico and Gulf of America, depending on the audience that they're dealing with, that is their prerogative. They have a First Amendment right to make that decision. So the basis with which they kicked them out was an unconstitutional basis, and it should have been a line in the sand that was drawn, and should have been, you don't. And if and I know the fear was, well, if you do a protest, they may not care. Okay, but you're not doing it for them. You're doing it to either continue or build trust with your audience. And by not defending your First Amendment moment in that, I think, frankly, these traditional media companies, they've already lost one half of the country over ideological concerns and bias concerns. Now, those that remained trusting you now may not trust you either. So what have you accomplished? You've actually hurt your business.
Although let's one more on media. I spend a lot of time thinking about trust in institutions, and obviously, in your and my working careers, there's been a precipitous decline in trust in the media.
Right.
Where in 1970, Cronkite was the most trusted man in America, and obviously
Right.
that's not true of any journalist today. What I was in reading, in refreshing my recollection of your background and thinking about your mentor and somebody I greatly admired, Tim Russert. If he had lived and he were still working, would he be as trusted as he always was? Do you believe he wouldn't be because he's at NBC? Do you believe he wouldn't be because we're in this new information ecosystem where people would criticize him, and either Team Red would criticize him for not calling out Biden's reduced capacities, or Team Blue would criticize him for saying, I'm not going to cover. Like, where would he be able to do this, or is this broader than the people?
I doubt anybody could survive this era. Okay. Let me just tell you this way. I've had this conversation with Luke Russert. I've had this conversation with Maureen Orth, Tim's widow. I almost don't want to go down the hypothetical because it's not fair to him, and it's not fair to frankly, and I almost feel too close to the situation. But let me flip the script on you. What if I told you the moderator of Meet the Press had been chief of staff to Mario Cuomo? Right? That wasn't a problem in the 90s and the aughts. Do you think that would have been a problem today?
Well, a problem in getting hired? No. I see tons of political media. If you worked in the Biden administration,
sure,
job at MSNBC. If you worked in the Trump, if you work in the
I'm not saying that's a good thing. You know who I blame for this? I blame LBJ. He was the first one. It's funny. Bill Moyers and Pat Buchanan, I always look at. They were the first two to break this seal, right? They were both journalists, and they both went into politics in different ways. Then they both left politics and went into journalism. And in a weird way, they blazed this trail in different ways. And I have never been comfortable with how we've done this. But it is what it is, right? And the political, I always said I didn't realize, I never accepted the premise that I was a politician, but I would argue over a majority of my time at Meet the Press, I think I was treated sometimes more like a politician than, what I believe I was actually being as a political anthropologist, right? And part of it was the weapon is using social media to look. Part of this was a concerted campaign to delegitimize the press. We know this. You weaken the referees, right? You weaken the credibility of the referees. You have a better chance of having your message believed. So, but referees, working the refs is something basketball coaches do too, right? It is, and in some ways, I sort of accepted the premise and respected it, because there was always a guardrail. There would only be so far it would be taken. Now there are no more guardrails on this stuff, and we've gotten, I would argue, sort of off the rails in how it's done. But I just it's in this case, this is why I think we've just got to start from scratch. I mean, I sort of look at it as like we got to go back to we all are born with original bias. I always check my pulse, right? Meaning there's no such thing as unbiased, because as human creatures, we come at everything with bias. It's where were we born? Who were we born to? When were we born, right? Where you live creates a bias. What your faith is creates a bias, right? Some of them are unconscious, but they're there. So what we really need to strive for is simply fairness, right? And I think recalibrating expectations, number one, and changing the tone. I think one of the biggest problems that has happened in the sort of the cable, starting with the cable news era, and I've got a whole look. There's a part of me that says the worst thing that this all actually began, this descent of the media began when a cable news network decided that the single most important story in America was a trial of a former football player. And by spending 6 months avoiding actual news stories and instead focusing on a trial of a celebrity football player, it sent the wrong message to media executives, because what the message it sent was, hey, if you make the news interesting enough, you can make news profitable. Why do we know this was so profitable? Because CNN was so successful in making money on the OJ trial that NBC and Fox said, hey, we want in, right? We want news channels. And two more started. And so we created, before 1994, I would argue that there was an accepted premise that news divisions simply were not to lose money. That's all. They were not being asked to make money. After O.J. Simpson, every news organization suddenly had a 5 to 10% profit goal that they had to hit. And I think it completely changed the nature of journalism, and we changed tone and tenor. I think most, journalism is too snarky. You can be antagonistic without being a jerk, right? You can be oppositional, but do so with grace. And I think we've somehow lost that because the ability to monetize news and information sometimes requires polarization or controversy.
Yeah.
And so our incentive structure is just completely warped and broken.
Well, so I think that's fair. I would say, though, I think when we want to put stuff in historical context,
Mm-hmm.
Certainly in the FDR and the JFK era, the media knew stuff and chose not to cover it because they
That's right.
maintain their inside buddy relationships. Some of, both the media's greatest 20th century moment, but in some ways, one of the seeds of its own destruction was the Watergate moment, where all
Yeah.
of a sudden it became your job is to break news and to blow things up. I ultimately would boil it all down to the media ecosystem was built for a pre-internet era. And
Yeah.
whether it's Craig Newmark and Craigslist, or the speed of scoops on Twitter,
Right.
or the ability to share your own preferred news, I mean, that's what's killing local news and so many other things. And
Right.
just like the printing press, the internet has broken lots of institutions that haven't found their way out to the other side. But I got Chuck Todd, so I got to turn to politics. It's like if it's Sunday, if it's
There you
Chuck
go.
Todd, it's politics. So
Let's talk politics.
well, and it's I've been listening to your guidance on
Hmm.
politics since, for me, 1996, when the hotline would come over the fax machine, which,
Yeah.
man, how old are we?
If you say the word fax machine, you have a pretty sophisticated audience. In fact, I see one of my good longtime friends, Rich Tao, in the audience. So it's not like these folks need to be reminded what a fax machine is. But if you're under the age of 40, you might.
Yeah. Well, so question one, how's President Trump doing? Because if you look at his net approval, it's the highest
Yeah.
it's ever really been, even though it's technically underwater. The Dem opposition is in the wilderness, although they had a
Hmm.
good week with Wisconsin.
Right.
Republicans seem entirely subservient, although they're kind of
Right.
nervous right now because the tariffs aren't going so well in the markets.
Right.
Trump sort of feels like he's at the height of his powers, more confident and less restrained than ever. What is your take on the state of the presidency? I'm sure you're not going to go to Simon Rosenberg.
Right.
Tomorrow it's all crashing,
Oh gosh. Yeah.
but
No, that's
probably
just all
also
partisan.
not Kellyanne Conway. Like, next stop,
Yeah.
Mount Rushmore.
No, look, I think he is, two things can be true at the same time. He's perhaps, I can't think of another president who's had this much influence and control over their party. Maybe it's FDR, maybe you could argue LBJ 65, 64, but even that was, Obama never had this type of influence over the Democratic Party that Donald Trump has, right? Picking and choosing who nominees should be and shouldn't be. So on one hand, we've never had a more powerful party leader as president in our lifetime. But I think this tariff decision is his Afghanistan withdrawal. If it was interesting, look, my thesis on politics right now is that we haven't voted for a president since 2008. We've been voting against. In many ways, the Obama reelect was as much about a vote against Romney than it was a vote for Obama. 16, I think, was a country deciding, no, 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 we're not doing Hillary Clinton. 2020 was no more Trump. It wasn't necessarily affirmation for Biden. And I think 24 was as much a rejection of Biden and Harris than it was necessarily an affirmation for Trump. So I think we're in a vote against mindset. Well, what does that mean? It actually means most presidents have very little leeway, right? Think about what happened to Biden. Things were going fine. One moment of incompetence and it was gone. It was gone, right? Bill Clinton had moments of incompetence and was able to get it back, right? He had Black Hawk Down could have been, essentially imagine one bad issue in the first 3 weeks derailing your entire presidency, in this case, first 6 months. And so I think that right now voters are giving our presidents very little grace because they've been negatively elected, right? They've won because of who they weren't more than they've won because of who they are. And Joe Biden never got over 45 after the Afghanistan withdrawal debacle.
Can I challenge that, though, Chuck?
And I will be shocked if Donald Trump gets back over 45, unless there's something we don't know that happens. Because I just think that he already was a polarizing figure, and manufacturing an economic downturn is not exactly a recipe for improving your approval rating.
Well, just on the Biden thing, what's so interesting, you're right. That was a moment that it never saw recovery.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe the difference with Clinton might in part be there was also, as it turned out, the stimulus package, the 1.9 trillion that Biden passed was about, combined with supply chains, was about to lead to 40-year high in inflation.
Right.
The removal of the rules on the southern border was in the middle of what the New York Times described as the 3 years of the most illegal immigration into this country. So while the Afghanistan moment was bad, I'm not sure it had we been on a peace and prosperity and controlling
I think that's fair.
border and less political correctness being imposed from the top, I bet he could have survived withdrawing us from what
maybe
was forever war.
Look, I take your point. I always looked at Afghanistan as sort of the people were already questioning the economy. I think you're right. I mean, in fairness, people were already like, wait a minute, how come the border? What are you doing here on the border? And look, and there'll be people that will argue from the Biden world that'll say, hey, we were just following the law. It wasn't our fault that Donald Trump had essentially kinked the hose, right? And Biden simply unkinked the hose and shoom, right? A whole bunch of folks came. But it was what it was. What I think Afghanistan did was cement the idea, oh, maybe these guys don't know what they're doing. And in fact, on the one topic we all thought Joe Biden was an expert at, right? Foreign relations and decision making and national security. Wait a minute. He's blowing that too. And so I do think what made it more damaging is because it was on the topic that that in many ways voters assumed he was an expert at.
Yeah.
Like he's not going to mess that stuff up, right? He may not be the best domestic president, but boy, everything I've known about Biden, he seems to have a level head about national security issues, et cetera, right? So, and certainly very engaged. So I do think the reason that moment was catastrophic for him politically, it was because it was on his, in theory, best issue.
Yeah. All right. 578 days from now, the midterms. I'm going to read back to your roots, the hotline. So 18 of the last 20 midterms, the party in the White House lost more than 3 seats, which would be flipping the chamber. 4 out of the last 5, the chamber flipped, and 9/11 meant that was forestalled for Bush until 06. Any chance the Republicans hold the House in 2026, and any chance the Democrats pick up the Senate? Like if there's stagflationary wins despite the difficult seats, give us your very early 578 day out prognoses.
Well, look, if you were doing this, if we were FanDuel or what's the other one, DraftKings, I think we would make the Democrats the favorite to pick up the House and the Republicans the favorite to hold the Senate, right? The Senate map is a tough map for Democrats in general. I can find 2, but they're also got a bunch of retirements that they're defending, and we all know the hardest races to hold are the ones where you don't have an incumbent running. And so Democrats are already starting in a hole with a couple of retirements, Michigan and New Hampshire being very much on the front burner. Illinois could be coming soon. I'm not saying Illinois, I think in this political environment, is probably going to be fine. But, the fact is anytime you're defending an open seat, it's a little bit harder. So it is, look, how many more days is the stock market going to drop? 1,000 points? If we start to get in an area where inflation is spiking and, the markets are cratering still and people feel like their retirement is dwindling away. And by the way, this to me is what makes this such a dangerous, precarious moment for elected Republicans, is that who's the most likely voter in a midterm? Somebody over the age of 50. Who's looking at the stock prices every day? Somebody over the age of 50. So because it's either they're near retirement or they're at retirement. And so I do think that this is why Democrats in general, I think, did better this week, right? The engaged electorate is an older electorate, and I think right now they're a bit unhappy. And so that I think that this is why. Here's something I would watch for that would tell me how bad this could get if this is a snowball effect for Republicans. How many House Republicans decide to run for another office? How many House Republicans decide to take that university president job in their district? How many House Republicans get offered an interesting job, by a guy named Bruce Mehlman? Things, I tease, but you see where I'm going. We know this, right? This is a pattern. By the way, why did all these Democratic senators already decide to go? Because they looked at the map and they're like, boy, even if Democrats do well in the midterms, I'm not going to be a committee chair again. And in fact, the soonest I'll be a committee chair, I might be 85, right? Like it's just not going to happen. Of course, one of my favorite reminders is how often political partisans don't know how to read a political environment. I remember a book in 1990. I was in college. It was a gentleman by the name of Peter Brown, who I think now runs the Quinnipiac poll, or once did run the Quinnipiac poll, but he was an AP reporter. And the book was about how the Democrats are going to become the permanent minority party, right? 2 years later, we know, they had full control they had the trifecta. I also remember our mutual friend Karl Rove thinking that they were building a permanent majority.
He said durable.
Durable. Yeah.
Very important. It was durable.
Right. And, that lasted 2 years, right? So the American public is pretty finicky like that, right? So I don't want to say never on the Senate side of things, but it is hard to imagine how this House, now that said, this is one of the fairest gerrymandered houses we've ever had, meaning there's plenty of gerrymandering, but it kind of balanced itself out. It's a fairly fair map. So I do think there is only so much elasticity here. I think we're looking at, the equivalent of a 60 seat gain from 2010 is probably 25, right?
Yeah.
Somewhere in that range. But the fact is they only need 4, or 3, depending on actuary tables, or people cleaning their gutters. I mean, this is one of those things where, it's happened at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. We've had some Congresses where literally what election night said was the majority changed because of special elections and deaths. But it is, here's the other thing. Let's say Donald Trump is right with his policy. Is it going to be bearing fruit by November of 2026? Like, what he's trying to do at best is a 10-year project. And that's if everybody starts building factories next month. So it's hard to imagine an environment that gets a lot of better unless there's some existential event that you and I, the point is that, Tom Brokaw used to love to talk about his version of UFOs where the unforeseen will occur. I always thought it was I see what you're trying to do there, Tom, but the point was correct in that, look, we don't know what we don't know that could contribute to people's feelings about the political environment come November 2026. But if history is any guide, I think we know what the most likely outcome is going to be.
All right. I got about 3 more minutes, way more questions than I'm going to have time for, but 1,313 days, Chuck, till the 2028 presidential elections. If you had to guess right now, in rank order, give me the 3 likeliest Republican nominees and the 3 likeliest Democratic nominees, with maybe a word on why you have them on your list. And also with the humility for both of us that people didn't see FDR coming before he came in 32. Nobody took Reagan as seriously as they should have taken him. Nobody had Donald Trump on the bingo card, or else Obama wouldn't have tried to humiliate him.
Right.
Give me your so odds are it'll be somebody not on either of our bingo cards. But
in fact, that's certainly how I feel. One of the examples I like to use is at this point in time during Trump's first term. Did you think the mayor of South Bend was going to be one of the most important Democratic Party figures come 2020, right? So, particularly the Democratic Party usually is looking for new. And by the way, when they find new, they're more likely to win than when they find somebody who's been waiting their turn. John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, Al Gore, you get the drift, right?
I've got a slide on that.
I would say if you were to ask me to name my 3 most likely Republican nominees in order, I would have it as J.D. Vance. I mean, sitting vice president's a sitting vice president, and we all know this. We saw it is very hard to dislodge a sitting vice president from a nomination for a political party, perhaps unless you're Henry Wallace. All right, I mean, but you get my point there. Donald Trump Jr.
Wow,
would be my second, and Glenn Youngkin would be my third. If you were to ask me, the conversation I hear the most is, boy, the Vance Youngkin primary is going to be intense. That's going to be like Ford Reagan 76. Okay, we'll see if it happens. But I accept the premise that I think Youngkin wants to run. We know Vance wants to run. I think the real wild card is Junior. Maybe it's a Vance Jr. ticket that runs during the primaries that sort of ends things. I wouldn't rule any of that out. But obviously, if the midterms go really poorly for the Republicans, it's going to open a door for, and I do think if you're going to go with a non-MAGA, it's got to be somebody who isn't antagonistic to MAGA. And I think, of everybody out there that has the resources, Youngkin is probably fairly well positioned. I think he's got a better bedside manner than Ron DeSantis, and he's a bit more charismatic than Brian Kemp, right? There's a lot of Brian Kemp would be my father's favorite candidate right now, but he also was the guy who loved Bob Dole in 1980 when no one else did. So he sort of doesn't mind the quiet curmudgeon, but I don't think that works in our internet-driven politics of today.
Dem
Boy,
side.
on the Democratic side, I really do believe that the the most likely nominee is somebody we're not at all talking about, and it could be somebody that wins in 26. Um, but when you look at, but if you were to look at it to sort of like, look, who's going to be putting together formidable campaigns? Pete Buttigieg is going to be able to put together the Obama team, right? He had it before, and I think most of what I would say Obama world, I bet you gravitates towards him. So he'll have an infrastructure that'll be pretty formidable. Wes Moore has to be in any top three list. Wes Moore's got a great biography, right? I do think being a veteran, particularly a Democratic candidate being a veteran, is an important asset and could be a really, really a powerful asset. He also ran one of the most well-funded charities in New York City called the Robin Hood. Is it the Robin Hood Foundation, I think?
Yep.
What does that mean? He probably knows as many rich people as anybody else in that world does. So his network will be, it's hard to say organizationally who would be stronger, Buttigieg or Wes Moore, but I think they both are there. And then I I I wonder what the appetite will be for Democrats to nominate a woman. I think Whitmer could be very strong candidate, but how much will that hurt? Will there be some donor headwind there? And I think it's not fair. I think both Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton. I will go to my grave believing Hillary Smith would have defeated Donald Trump. I do believe her last name was a bigger problem than her first name. But there is also the fact that many Democrats I talk to say to themselves, well, the two last to lose were women. The country's not ready, right? They've just jumped to that conclusion. But I think the Democrats need a big ideological fight. I think one of the things that's underrated in political parties is having a very public fight about which direction a party should go. I knew a lot of Democrats in 2015 who were so excited that Republicans were so divided. Well, you know what it did? It clarified who the Republicans were, and arguably, this is the most united version of a Republican Party you and I have seen in an incredibly long time. Now, we may think it may not align very well to win swing voters very often, but it has become, they've won two of the last three presidential elections. So the fight worked. Take the Democrats in 1990 when Bill Clinton and Jesse Jackson essentially were the avatars for the left versus center fight. DLC versus the Democratic National Committee. It was messy. A lot of Republicans thought it was going to keep the party divided. A lot of big-time Democrats decided not to run in 92 thinking that it was a losing proposition, both for their party unity issues and for what appeared to be extra strength there with George H.W. Bush. So I think the Democratic Party needs a big fight. And I think that I'm wondering when it's going to get started. I think Fetterman actually is trying to start one, and I think Sanders wants to start one, and I wonder if that happens sooner rather than later. So I have a hard time picking who's the number three there, because I think that I think you have to assume somebody from the progressive lane is in that third camp. I don't put Buttigieg and Moore there. I think those are candidates that progressives would accept, right? Sort of an elected, that they would be okay with it. But I think, is it AOC? I think if she runs, I think she's very formidable too. I think I'd have to put her as one of the most three likely if she runs.
She's a formidable political athlete. A Vance Buttigieg debate would be must-see TV. That'd be pretty extraordinary. But so, Chuck,
it's not like every dorm room debate I rolled my eyes at when I was in college, but you're probably right? Like
they're both smooth, but fair point.
Yeah.
It would be a lot of ideology. So, very last question: give us a book recommendation before we let you go.
Oh, wow. I will say that the most important book to understand what happened to the Democratic Party is Roy Teixeira's book, Where Have All the Democrats Gone?
We had
I
him on this very program.
I'm teaching a class at USC's DC campus. And I give my midterm exam is I give them, I selected 4 or 5 books that I think are very, I think if I were to read 2 books, right, recommend 2 books actually to tell you, explain what's happened inside the Republican Party and what's happened inside the Democratic Party. The Democratic book would be Roy Teixeira's, and the Republican book would be the McKay Coppins Romney book, which I just still one of the most remarkable decisions I've ever seen a politician make in what Mitt Romney did. Here you go. Here's all my innermost thoughts of when I ran. And it really does, it's not about Mitt Romney, that book, in my opinion. That book is watching the Republican Party move from being an Eisenhower Bush wing of the party to this transition towards Donald Trump and populism.
You have been generous with your time. We wish you luck in success.
Thank you, my friend.
If the newly funded thing is looking for a lobbying firm to purchase, we're good cash flow. Give me a holler. But Chuck, thanks for making the time. Really great to see you.
Well, you have a pretty smart audience, and what I really may want you for is I may need you to put together my PowerPoint presentation. Nobody does slides like you, my friend.
I'm your man. I'll talk to you. Thank you.
All right, brother.